Hey, y'all. Who dat? And welcome in. I am Jeff Nowak. This is Inside Black and Gold. I'm coming at you solo, and I say this a lot, but because Steve's not here. He's hanging out on a beach somewhere trying not to get eaten by a shark. I think he is at one of those beaches. I think the sharks have decided that Florida is where they hang out. So just, I don't know. Hopefully he can avoid, coming face to face with Jaws. I don't know. But today, we are going to go through the Saints 53-man roster projection. So strap in. I posted this on WWL.com on Wednesday. So if you want to follow along, go over there, check it out. We're going to be breaking it all down. It's going to be a very straightforward episode. Going to go through all of that. Only one bit of news at the top. So we're going to hit that. Then we're going to talk quarterback and specialists because those are two pretty straightforward positions, and I kind of look at them independently of the offense and the defense. Obviously, the quarterback is the most important piece of the offense, but it's kind of a different conversation in terms of, okay, roster spot versus special teams versus new kickoff rule. How will that affect the numbers game? Let's just get it out of the way. But before I go into any of that, remember, if you haven't subscribed yet, please do that. Even if you watch on YouTube, go over to where you get your podcast, hit the subscribe button, hit auto download. If you're feeling crazy, hit auto download, maybe even leave a review. If you're on Apple Podcasts, really does help us out. We do want to hear from you as well. So if you want to hit me up on Twitter at Jeff_Nowak, DMs are always open. That's actually true now. I was told one of our listeners actually reached out and was like, hey, you say your DMs are open, but they're not. And that was news to me because I've always erred on the side of keeping DMs open to everybody. I guess Twitter or Elon Musk's in their infinite wisdom, they changed the settings to default to if you have Twitter X or whatever they call it, then it only allows verified people to DM you. Like they auto select that as your option. So for a while now, only people who are verified for some reason were able to DM me. I've changed that. So now all of you ingrates can DM me. So please do that. I really do like hearing from you. I like the suggestions. I like the feedback, even when it's not nice. Get a lot of that in comments on YouTube, but it's always good to have conversations with people. If you want to shoot me an email, feel free to do that as well. It's my full name, Jeffrey.Nowak@Audacy.com. Like genuinely, hit me up, DM me, whatever. Love to hear from y'all. I appreciate everyone who listens. And if you're someone who finds yourself onto our videos a lot, you're someone who ends up streaming us a lot, and you're not subscribed, why not? What are you doing? Anyway, even if you hate listening, I don't know, support us, whatever. And people ask me, okay, how do we support the pod? We don't ask for money. We don't ask for subscriptions. But if, hey, you have a family member, a friend who does like to listen to podcasts, is a fan of the Saints, or even just likes to hate on the Saints, suggest us. That's all we ask. Say, hey, I listen to this podcast. I think you'd like this podcast. Check it out. And that's the only real way to grow a podcast, right? We need dedicated listeners who, I don't want to say convert other listeners because that sounds oddly religious. And Louisiana does that on its own. But whatever you want to call it, if you could do that, I could not thank you enough. It is just something from the bottom of my heart that I do mean. Anyone who helps us grow this podcast is someone that I genuinely appreciate. So without further ado, I'm going to stop preaching about that and I'm going to start preaching about special teams, right? And, the only bit of news that I have really for today that has emerged in the days since the last podcast, which, we talked about, they signed Jesper Horsted, the first signing out of camp, really kind of bulk up the tight end position. He's going to be someone we talk about in this roster projection. The Saints have also signed defensive back Roderick Teamer, or at least they are planning to sign as of the recording of this podcast. They haven't officially announced it, but if you recognize that name, former Tulane guy, he's been in the NFL for several years. He came in as a UDFA in 2019 with the Chargers, spent the last several years with the Raiders. So he has some familiarity with several members of the Saints coaching staff, obviously. He has familiarity with Derek Carr. I assume they were in the same locker room together. Foster Moreau, any of these former Raiders connections, Jesper Horsted is another of those, he's been in the same locker room with. So they know him. He was a rookie minicamp tryout. Then he was a regular minicamp tryout. He was not at OTA, so he did not do enough during the rookie minicamp to earn a OTA invite, but he did do enough during the minicamp tryout to earn a training camp tryout. And the Saints have a decent history of, okay, you bring in a guy for a tryout, give him a chance, and they can contribute. Look at Lynn Bowden Jr. last year. He was a tryout player. He ended up sticking around for training camp, got cut, was a priority practice squad guy. And then throughout the course of the season, you had injuries. He was brought up and he made an impact. He was an impact player for the Saints in a lot of different ways. So you can do that. That is a route you can take. It's non-traditional, but we'll see how that goes. I would say that this roster is going to be a tough nut to crack at defensive back, but there's going to be roster spots handed out specifically because you are the best option for kickoff coverage, kickoff, special teams in general, right? So that's where, if I'm Roderick Teamer, I need to make an impact. But we're going to dive into that in the third segment when we get into the defense. The first segment, obviously, as I mentioned, going to be quarterback and specialist the rest of the way here. Second segment is going to be the rest of the offense. So let's just get kicker, punter out of the way first. We talked a lot about this in the last episode, so I don't need to go into my spiel about Darren Rizzi really likes Blake Grupe. Darren Rizzi really likes Lou Hedley, right? And I get it. You may not like those two guys, but I need to tell you that your opinion does not hold that much weight. Darren Rizzi's opinion, in a lot of ways, is the only amount of weight that you need for these guys to make the roster. Like, you look back at last year, and if you don't think that Lou Hedley unseating Blake Gillikin and Blake Grupe unseating Will Lutz can be directly tied to Darren Rizzi, you're kidding yourself. That doesn't happen unless Darren Rizzi is championing those guys. So, as much as you may have been frustrated with some of the missed kicks, those two sub 30 yarders, I think they were both 29 yarders from Blake Grupe. Those were the real blemishes on his rookie season that you can look back and say that just wasn't good enough. On the whole, I think the Saints were satisfied with what he did, and I think Darren was satisfied with what he did. And you look at a rookie kicker, and you can't take away those two missed short kicks, but you can say, that's an aberration. He was perfect on extra points, which are actually longer. And you look at, okay, was there an issue with the exchange? Was there an issue with the snap? Was there an issue with the setup? And, I think in most cases, in 9 out of 10 cases, when you shank a short kick like that, it's almost always going to be something to do with the operation. So, okay, fix that. Fix whatever issue was there. Hey, maybe you need to get better at kicking imperfect holds, right? Maybe that was an issue and you need to work on that. Either way, that's what's going to be looked at this year. Like, you can become enamored with Charlie Smith and the strength in that leg. We've seen him make it from 66 yards. I think that he is a long play. I think you're bringing him in, seeing if you can develop him. And he's going to end up on that practice squad in that international player spot, and you're going to move on. But, that's just what it is. So right now, the keeps, the players that are making the roster, it's always 3: kicker, punter, long snapper, and you got Blake Grupe, Zach Wood, Lou Hedley. We talked a lot about Lou Hedley in the last episode. We've seen him kind of improving in that flip the field type kick territory, and that's where he needs to improve. And he's going to get a chance to improve. I just don't see any scenario where either of those guys falls flat on their face, which is what would have to happen for them to get beat. Now, injuries happen. You never know what that could bring, right? We saw Will Lutz miss an entire season with a core muscle injury. Like, they do happen. So that's something to watch out for. But right now I'm just projecting that, okay, the kicker and punter situation is pretty straightforward. And the question is not going to be who makes it. The question is going to be, how do they improve year over year? Next, kind of basic, straightforward position. And we're talking quarterback. A lot of these positions are pretty straightforward. It's only like 2 or 3 spots at the bottom of the depth chart that you have to figure out. So when it comes to quarterback, we know what's going to happen at the top. I don't know who needs to hear this, but Derek Carr is the starting quarterback. That's not a question. That's really never been a question. And it's not about competition either. Like, we can say, okay, he should be competing for that job. Even if you were looking at this as a straight up competition, he would be winning that competition. Like, it's just not a conversation worth having. Jake Haener and Spencer Rattler are both young, intriguing quarterbacks, but we don't have to sit here and pretend that this is something that we should be discussing when it's just very clear that there is a starting quarterback and then 2 guys who are competing to be backups. Like, let's just be honest about it. Derek's making the roster. Again, I don't know who needs to hear that. Derek is your starting quarterback, and you're going to see how it works in the new offense. So the question becomes, okay, the next 3 quarterbacks, Jake Haener, Spencer Rattler, Nathan Peterman. I think we can eliminate Nathan Peterman from that discussion based on nothing more than we've seen how they've operated throughout minicamp, throughout OTAs, right? Like, if you added them up, I think Jake would have gotten more second team reps, but it's tough to say. And here's the thing. I think when you look at it, we were out there for 1 day of the OTA sessions. And one of the reasons that we didn't know about kind of the flipping, the alternating, is because we were out there for Tuesdays on the first 2 sessions of OTAs. And we were out there on a Wednesday, which is the second day of practice, for the third session of OTAs. We saw Jake Haener take second team reps all 3 times. And if they were alternating, that means that the first 2 OTA sessions, you had Jake on Tuesday, Spencer on Wednesday, and Jake on Thursday. For the final OTA session, we saw Jake on Wednesday, which would indicate to me that you saw Spencer getting the second team reps on Tuesday and Thursday. It doesn't necessarily mean a ton, but it does kind of give you an indication that this is a competition that's going to be going back and forth. In minicamp, we saw Jake get the second team reps on Tuesday, third team reps on Wednesday, and second team reps on Tuesday. So that to me indicates that Jake is slightly ahead. And what we've seen is Jake is ahead, right? Like we've seen Jake be a little bit more confident, a little bit more consistent. I think things have gotten a lot closer when you kind of look at the whole of the work based on what we saw in the first 2 sessions of OTAs to what we saw in minicamp, which was Spencer just looks like he's progressing. He looks like a guy who could be a backup quarterback in his rookie season. I still don't think that's likely. And so when you look at this, obviously you're cutting Nathan Peterman, who we've seen him take 5 maybe total reps in team drills. Like he is very clearly kind of the depth piece, the coach in the room, if you will. And then, so you're looking at Spencer and Jake. I think you're going to end up keeping 3 quarterbacks. Any scenario where Jake Haener is the backup quarterback. And right now, that's who I would pick. So I'm keeping 3 quarterbacks. Now, if Spencer takes that job, then I think there is a scenario where you do only keep the 2 quarterbacks and you use that extra roster spot somewhere else where you're making a difficult cut. Because I don't think you're going to keep Jake as a developmental third quarterback. I do think that there's really no scenario where Spencer Rattler gets cut in his rookie season, because when you're drafting a quarterback in the mid rounds, you're doing that with the idea that you're going to develop him. And so even if he struggles mightily in the preseason, you look at that and say, hey, okay, this is stuff to work on for next year. Cutting him because he's struggling as a 5th round rookie, why'd you draft him in the first place, right? Like it would fly in the face of the entire idea. So with that in mind, how I have it right now is I have Jake Haener as the backup quarterback. I have Spencer Rattler as that third quarterback who's going to be probably inactive on game days. You could say he's the emergency third quarterback if you want. I think Taysom Hill would kind of be the emergency third quarterback in reality. So I think for Spencer, even if in this scenario, even to get in a game, you would have to have injuries to Derek Carr, Jake Haener, and Taysom Hill before he would get in a game. But either way, that's how I see it shaping up. So these first 2 spots, you're keeping the maximum in terms of 6 players between your specialists and your quarterback. So that leaves 47 spots down the roster that we have to fill out. I'm going to tell you in advance, I'm keeping a few. I'm limiting the numbers at some positions that I would normally search for, because I think you're going to need to keep a handful of extra players specifically for matchups on kickoff, kick coverage. And so before you get mad that, how are you not keeping 10 offensive linemen? That's the methodology here. I'm also, and I'm going to end up explaining this several times, when I look at these positions, I'm also going to err on the side of, if I have seen you play, you're going to have a better shot of making this roster. There are several players that I think are going to make the roster that I do not have making the roster in this projection because they haven't gotten on the field yet. Now, Kool-Aid McKinstry is an exception. You're not cutting your 2nd round pick, but some of these depth guys, these veteran guys who you signed and we really just haven't seen yet, I can't in good faith say they're making the roster until I see them on the field. So keep that in mind, where these are going to change. There's a reason this is an early projection, because it's going to be wrong when we learn more, and we are going to learn a heck of a lot more. The next time we're going to see them on the field is going to be out in Irvine, California. We're getting our flights booked. We're getting our lodging set up. I'm excited about it. First practice is going to be July 24th, and we'll, I'm sure, update this around them. But all right, first segment in the books. Next segment, we're going to talk about the offense. Going to save the defense for last because it's going to be several positions that we need to kind of discuss in terms of specific roles, and it's just going to be easier to do that in the last segment, heading out the door. But all right, I'm Jeff Nowak. This is Inside Black and Gold again, as I begged earlier in the podcast. If you haven't subscribed yet, why not? Well, you've made it all the way here. You don't hate me yet. So why don't you hit that subscribe? Ring the bell if you're watching on YouTube. If you're listening in your podcast player or wherever you are, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Otherwise, stick around. We'll be right back again inside Black ampersand Gold. And we're back on Inside Black and Gold, a podcast that you listen to. And I know that because you're hearing this. If you're hearing this, you're listening to it. So there is no way around that. I hate to break it to you, but right now you are a listener of this podcast. And I'm going to call you that. Congratulations. I'm Jeff Nowak. We are going through the Saints 53-man roster projection that I posted on WWL.com earlier this week. So again, if you want to follow along, go check that out. And while you're doing that, hit the subscribe button. Why the hell not? But all right, we went through quarterback and specialists in the last segment. So this segment's going to be all offense. But if you are interested, if somehow you ended up here on this second segment thinking, I want to hear more about how Derek Carr is the starting quarterback of the Saints, hop on back to that first segment and we break it all down there. We're not going to talk about it here. We're going to talk about the rest of the offense. And with that in mind, we're going to start at running back, the position where everyone's got a feeling, and that feeling is, I think you kind of need Alvin Kamara happy for any good things to happen for the Saints this year. Alvin Kamara kind of staged a walkout, I guess would be the word. I don't know. It's not a holdout because he was there. I think he probably will pick up a fine if the Saints are feeling randy about that whole situation. They want to kind of enforce you can't just leave minicamp in the middle of the day and say you were there, and it's mandatory. So I think it'd be like a $17,000 fine if they really want to play hardball. I think they would have to kind of report that and enforce that, and we'll see. But either way, the running back position, I'm combining running back and fullback, and that's notable because I'm considering Taysom Hill as a fullback in these projections. Now, you could debate that he should be with the quarterbacks, that he should be with the tight ends. Based on what we've seen so far, he's going to operate as a fullback. And just for the interest of keeping these numbers where you would kind of reasonably have them, I don't want to have to explain, we're keeping 4 quarterbacks, even though, okay, it's not really keeping 4 quarterbacks because Taysom Hill is going to play quarterback. I don't know, never. So, and I also don't think that you're going to really consider when you're looking at the tight end room, well, we have Taysom, so we only need to keep 1 other tight end or 2 other tight ends. Like, you're going to keep as many tight ends as you feel you need independently of Taysom Hill. So I have him at fullback. What does that affect? Well, I think if you are considering Taysom Hill to be a fullback, then you're not keeping another fullback on the 53-man roster. So that's Xander Horvath, Adam Prentice. I have them both as cuts. Okay, so what do you do with them? Well, the Saints have been a team in the last several years that really does take advantage of the ability to elevate players from the practice squad. They plan for it. They do it, right? A lot of times they'll elevate somebody 3 times and then sign them because that was the plan all along. You're keeping them around. They're still involved. They know your offense. They know your schemes. They know, or on the defensive side, they know your defense. They know your schemes. And then if you get into a situation where you end up with a roster spot, which always happens because you always have injuries, then that typically will become the player. Anyone you're calling up will be first on the list of, okay, we're going to sign somebody anyway. And you're going to go from there. And so I think if your goal is to have Taysom kind of fulfill a majority of that fullback role, and you also have Jamal Williams on the roster, you don't need to keep Xander Horvath or Adam Prentice on the active roster. You throw them into the practice squad and you elevate them as you need them. Now, which one do you keep? That's a better question. But right now, we're just going to say cuts. Okay, so the cuts are Xander Horvath, Adam Prentice, Jacob Kabodi, and Jordan Mims. I'm keeping this straightforward because that's just the obvious situation. So the keeps, Alvin Kamara, Kendre Miller, Jamal Williams, Taysom Hill as the fullback, whatever the hell you want to call him. But for now, that's how I'm going with it. I left Jamal Williams off my initial 53-man roster. I feel like I've seen enough, right, to add him back on here. I also think, one thing that's become clear, both kind of watching and also listening to some of the comments, some of the interviews, Jamal Williams is looked at in that running back room as a leader. And whenever you can say that about a person, it helps your standing on the roster. Like, it helps your standing with the running back room. It helps your standing with the coaching staff. So you even if you're not making as big of an impact as maybe you would have hoped in year one and year two, that leadership keeps you in the good graces of the coaches, and it keeps you in a situation where people want to keep you around. When Derek Carr talked to the media, he was listing, and this was inadvertent, but I think it's telling. He's listing team leaders, and he's like, yeah, Eric McCoy, Taysom Hill, Foster Moreau, blah, blah, blah. And he says Jamal in that list. He didn't say Alvin. He said Jamal. So kind of when he's defaulting and just talking about the leader in the running back room, he says Jamal. So I think that's telling. Either way, Alvin is the star. So whoever the star is and whoever the leader is, whatever, I just think that you're going to err toward that side. I also think, Kendre Miller is tough because if he had played, 10 plus games, 12 plus games, and looked like he did in that week 18 game a lot more often last year, then this Alvin Kamara contract situation sounds a lot different. The conversation we'd be having is a lot different. If you had any confidence whatsoever that it's like, oh yeah, we can just see what we have in Kendre. And we just haven't gotten a chance to see him on the field. And I think that's part of the reason that Alvin is feeling like, hey, I'm going to take advantage of this opportunity I have right now, because going into next season, if Kendre is able to stay on the field and you get, 600-700 yards of offense, he's able to take over in a couple games. Say Alvin gets hurt and misses a game or two and he's the number one running back and he looks good. You look at kind of how things went with Tony Pollard and Ezekiel Elliott. That's one of the closest contemporaries I can think of in terms of, a veteran running back who has been that guy and then the team kind of moves on. Now, Tony Pollard, they moved on from him as well. It didn't work out, but that's kind of where I see it in terms of you don't have that ability right now to say, yeah, okay, we've seen what Kendre can bring over an extended period of time, and we can afford to play hardball with Alvin. I don't think you have that. I think Alvin's going to get some sort of deal, and you're going to go from there. But from a roster perspective, that's pretty simple. All right, moving on. The tight end position. So if you're keeping count, that is now 10 total roster spots. 10 of the 53 roster spots are gone. Tight end. Now, I think you're keeping 3. And this is the only position where I have a rookie UDFA making the roster. And I know people are going to be happy about that. People were annoyed that I left Alan Halker off the initial 53-man roster. But again, I just need to see him on the field before I can make a determination. It's kind of the only fair way to do it. And what I've seen is the upside is there, right? The upside is a little higher than maybe a Michael Jacobson, who I think is a really solid developmental player, but I just don't think is ready physically to play at the NFL level. And so we'll see. My cuts here, Michael Jacobson, Jesper Horsted, Tommy Hudson. Now, Jesper is an intriguing guy. And once we see him on the field, I may change my tune in terms of Dallin versus Jesper. But for now, it's just a guy with a name that I've never heard before. And I'm not going to put him on the active roster until I see it. It's still telling that they brought him in quickly, that he was kind of high on that list. And we'll see how that goes. The elephant in the room here is, okay, how much time does Juwan Johnson miss? Foster Moreau was the other obvious player that you're keeping. And then Taysom Hill, if you wanted to throw him down here on this list and say, okay, you're keeping 4 tight ends and maybe you consider him not a fullback and you keep a fullback up there, that's a debate you could have. For now, I'm not doing that. And so it's Juwan, Foster, and Dallin. And you're going to go. Like, now, the question I have is, can Dallin do more than just catch passes? Because that's what you really need to make a roster as a rookie UDFA, is you need to have more than just one skill set at the tight end position. It is a position that blocks and catches passes, right? You can't just run routes, and it's just not something we're going to be able to see until the pads come on. So I'm putting a kind of an asterisk next to him saying he did what I needed to see in minicamp. Can he do what I need to see from him in training camp with people actually trying to knock him on his ass? And that's going to be a question. But for now, I feel okay with that. And you're going to move on. Next position, wide receiver. And this one is tough because my initial 53, I had Stanley Morgan on it. My problem with Stanley is we just have not seen him. I don't know what he's going to look like. I don't know if he can contribute as a wide receiver. I don't know where they're going to aim to use him on special teams. I think ultimately he ends up making this roster as a special teams ace, but we don't know right now. So he's on the cut list. My other cuts, Jermaine Jackson, who I think you're going to keep on the practice squad as a backup return specialist, and then Mason Tipton out of Yale, who I think has shown some decent traits. Maybe you try to keep him around as well, but I just don't see him knocking off any of the players here. I'm keeping 6 wide receivers. So if you're keeping count, this will bring us up to 19 players. And the top of this list is easy, right? The top of this list, Chris Olave, Rashid Shaheed, A.T. Perry, who I'm not entirely sure what his role is going to be this year, but I am highly confident that he's not missing this roster. Okay, so like there's 2 questions there. There's how do you use him, but also I am not cutting him in year 2 because I am expecting growth and a progression, even if he is not technically the wide receiver 3. So with that, I'm giving you 3 more names that I'm keeping on this roster, and it is Cedric Wilson, it is Bub Means, and it is Equanimous St. Brown. So now if you would replace one of those 2 names with Stanley Morgan, right now it would probably be Equanimous, but I'll give you kind of a scenario in that, like, I think that A.T. Perry versus Cedric Wilson is going to affect Equanimous versus Stanley. And what I mean by that is, if Cedric Wilson is your wide receiver 3, and I think that's possible. We've seen him be very involved. He understands the type of system the Saints are going to. He can play multiple positions. They brought him in for a reason, and I think that reason is he's going to be kind of that veteran in the room. And so with the more sleight of frame guys in Chris and Rashid, I think it might make sense to have kind of a veteran option there at wide receiver 3. And so if that's the case, and you're keeping A.T. Perry and Bub Means as those developmental draft picks that you just don't want to cut if you don't have to, then yeah, that cuts Equanimous out at the bottom. You could argue that you only keep 5 wide receivers. I think you're keeping 6 because you brought in Stanley Morgan as that special teams ace anyway, and I think that just makes sense. Now, if A.T. Perry ends up being kind of your wide receiver 3, I think that changes the equation, because that means that the next wide receiver you keep has to have a role in whatever you're asking him to do. And I think if you're asking somebody to block, and keep in mind, the upside of this wide receiver core is not in blocking. It is not in blocking. It is in pass catching. It is in route running. It is in speed. And in A.T. Perry's case, elite length, not necessarily bulk and size. Then I need a wide receiver that can block and can do it at a high level. And that's something that I know Equanimous St. Brown can do. I don't know if Cedric Wilson can do that at an elite level. And that's kind of what I'm looking at. So if Cedric Wilson kind of comes in as my wide receiver 4, then I do think you take a much longer look at Equanimous St. Brown, knowing that Bub Means is kind of a factor there as well, but I don't know how much I'm going to trust him as a rookie. He's probably going to be inactive early in the season. And then you have a special teams ace anyway, so you don't need that next wide receiver to be that guy. And I just, you saw that with Keith Kirkwood last year, and he kind of became a tell on offense at times because anytime he was on the field, he was blocking. Same thing with Lynn Bowden. Like they were just blocking specialists, but at times they need that. And so that's kind of where I balance that. If A.T. Perry is your wide receiver 3, I'm keeping Equanimous St. Brown. And if Cedric Wilson is your wide receiver 3, I think that means some different things for Equanimous. But either way, right now, Olave, Shaheed, Perry, Wilson, Means, and St. Brown. Moving on, one last position on offense to break down, and we have 9 offensive linemen. Normally, I would err toward 10 because that gives you a backup at every position. Like, that's really the only reason I'd go for 10, because you want a clean backup at every position. If all 5 of your offensive linemen got hurt in one game, you would have an option. Now, that's kind of a misnomer, because typically you'll have a rookie or a young player that you'll have inactive. That was Nick Saldiveri last year. So you're not really going for that. But so say you have a guy on IR, you don't need to worry about signing somebody. You have someone cross-training at every position in case they need to go in and start at that position or play that position during a game. I don't think you necessarily need that, because you have several players on this roster that can play multiple positions. So let's just run down the list of the keeps right now. And the obvious ones are the starters, or at least the players who are getting first team reps. during minicamp, and that's Trevor Penning at right tackle, Cesar Ruiz at right guard, Eric McCoy at center, Nick Saldiveri at left guard, and Taliese Fuwanga at left tackle. Now, there's a lot of youth there. So I'm not necessarily going to look toward young backups. I'm going to look toward veteran backups. And so my cuts are a bunch of UDFAs, right? So my cuts are Sincere Hainsworth, Kyle Hergel, Nori Nuili. I'm also right now cutting Oli Udo and Mark Evans. And the only draft pick that I am cutting is Josiah Ezram, 7th round pick. I think you're going to keep him around in the practice squad. You're going to develop him, but I don't think you need to say, well, we got to keep him. He was a draft pick, right? Now, maybe he comes and shines in training camp, and that makes you feel differently. But right now, he's on the cut line. So the guys I'm keeping after those initial starting 5, Landon Young, who is kind of your swing tackle. I think he becomes the new James Hurst. And we've seen him work at right tackle and left tackle. I just like having a guy who can play either spot in a pinch. I don't see him being a starting caliber tackle in the NFL anytime soon, but I feel like he's a guy that if you need him to start, you feel okay about it because he's done the work and you know what to expect from him, right? Like he's not a wild card. You know what he can do. Beyond him, that's a question. So I'm keeping Justin Herron right now. I think Oli Udo is a guy kind of like Stanley Morgan, who once we see him on the field and we see him, the vision they have for him in this offense, he ends up taking that spot. I think he's kind of your backup right tackle at the end of the day, and Landon Young becomes your backup left tackle in that kind of direct backup scenario. But for now, I'm keeping Justin Herron because we've seen him on the field, and I think you earn something when you're able to get on the field and work in front of some eyeballs. So we're doing that. The next two, Shane Lemieux and Lucas Patrick. What I like about these guys is they are versatile. Both can play center. And so if I'm trying to find backup interior linemen and I only need to keep 2 instead of 3, that's a win, right? So you have Lucas Patrick, who has been kind of that devoted backup center, and you have Shane Lemieux, who has been kind of that devoted left guard, who can play center and has played center throughout his career. I imagine you'll also kind of cross-train Lucas at the right guard spot so that you don't have to keep a dedicated backup right guard. And Cesar has been a pretty healthy guy. We haven't seen Cesar miss a lot of games. We haven't seen Cesar deal with a ton of injuries. So I'm not necessarily looking at him and saying we really need to have a top end backup because he's an injury prone guy. I don't see that. So I'm okay keeping 9 offensive linemen, knowing that you probably want to keep an extra linebacker and safety on the defensive side of the ball. Again, I just think Oli Udo is a guy who probably will work his way into this position group. And then, if you wanted to keep a UDFA, Kyle Hergel is probably at the top of that list. He's probably the closest to the roster right now, but we'll have to see. But all right, so if you're keeping count, that's 3 specialists, 3 quarterbacks, 4 running backs / fullbacks. So that puts you at 10, 3 tight ends, 6 wide receivers. So that's 19. And then 9 offensive linemen. So that puts you at 28 players kept on the roster. That means that you have 25 roster spots remaining on the defense. And that's where I'm going to stop this segment. We're going to go into the next segment. We're going to go through the entire defensive side of the ball. It's going to be a lot of talk about special teams. And I know everyone loves when I talk about special teams. That's everyone's favorite time of the week. That is insincere. But that's just got to be a big part of this conversation whenever we talk about the 53-man roster. You're probably tired of me talking about it by now, but hey, this is going to be the last roster projection for a while, so let's get our money's worth. But all right, this is Inside Black and Gold. We're going to come back. We're going to project the entire defensive roster, 25 more roster spots to go, and then I'll make some notes about pup players, practice squad players, that sort of thing. Either way, who dat? This is Inside Black and Gold. Subscribe and stick around. And we're back on Inside Black and Gold. I'm Jeff Nowak coming at you solo. One more segment to go as we break down the 53-man roster projection that I posted on WWL.com earlier in the week. So if you want to follow along there, there's write-ups for every position, written a lot more eloquently than I can speak them. Make sure to go check that out. Also, during the break, I went and addressed the weird flyaway hair that keeps falling down on my forehead. If you've been watching this on YouTube, you've probably seen it teleport back to the top of my head at least once or twice because it was driving me nuts. And so I will, there's cuts where, and I thought about this as we were going through. It's like I would start talking, and then I would see it, and I would fix it, and then I would continue. But then I was like, when I cut it, it'll be a hair on my head, and then it'll just disappear. So it's like magic. Hopefully that's not an issue that we have here, but anyone on the podcast version of this is like, this is annoying. I will stop talking about it. So let's get into the defensive side of the equation. As we mentioned, 28 spots filled between quarterback, specialist, running back, tight end, wide receiver, offensive line. So that means that there are 25 roster spots left for defense. And a lot of these are going to be tinged with, hey, this is a special teams guy. So keep that in mind. And anytime you're trying to project a roster, right, and you're looking at the 5th or 6th roster spot, and I say this all the time, it's almost never about what you do as your position value, right? Like if you're the 6th wide receiver on a roster, it's not about your pass catching ability. Now, if you're a rookie, maybe that helps you in terms of we don't want to cut this guy, even if he's not going to contribute that much this year. But even then, you would be expected to contribute on special teams if you're active. So it's always something that we talk about. It's like, oh, this guy's standing out in camp as a receiver. Is he going to make the roster? Maybe. But like Shaq Davis is a good example last year. Everyone loves Shaq Davis. He made a big impact in the preseason games, but it was always going to come down to, can you make an impact when you're not playing in the normal offense? And in a lot of cases, that's a no. Like think of Emmanuel Butler, think of guys like that. So again, when we're talking about this, keep that in mind. Like a Millard Bradford has 3 interceptions. He's not going to make the 53-man roster based on the strength of a handful of interceptions when 90% of his action is going to be covering kicks. So again, remember that. I'm breaking up a couple of these, right? So in the past, I may have said defensive back and just lumped cornerback and safety together. I would have said defensive line and just lumped defensive end and defensive tackle together. This year, I'm not doing that. And I think that's the right way to do it because, you know, you kind of have to look at, okay, how many pass rushers do we have? How many interior linemen do we have? And in this case, I would have been torn in terms of, I need to find an extra couple of roster spots for special teams dedicated players. And when you're looking at defensive end, it's tough to keep 6, right? What made it more likely was Tano Passanio, who had that inside-outside potential. And I probably would have, if without the injury to Tano, I probably would have said, I'm going to keep 6 defensive ends and 3 defensive tackles, knowing that on passing downs, I'm going to want to shift Tano inside anyway. Without Tano, that changes. I think you flip that because I'm not going to kind of pigeonhole a player into saying, well, you're going to be that inside rusher now. I wouldn't mind seeing the Saints find one of these 5 pass rushers who can bump inside. Maybe Cam Jordan does that for the first time this year. He did it as a rookie. We haven't seen him do that. But if you're going to take him off the field on passing downs anyway, maybe this is an opportunity to see if that inside potential exists. And if so, just an opportunity for him to get on the field more, which we know he wants. He does not want to come off the field. And so if he can be your NASCAR guy and bump inside, just an opportunity to get on the field. But either way, I'm only keeping 5 defensive ends, and that list is pretty solid when you think about it. So Cam Jordan, obviously, then Carl Granderson, Chase Young, Peyton Turner, Isaiah Foskey. Not a lot of controversy here. With the exception of Carl Granderson, who ironically is the guy I'm most confident in, 4 of these are first or second round draft picks, right? Cam Jordan was a first round pick way back when. Chase Young was a first round pick by the Commanders. I think he was number 2 overall. Peyton Turner was a first round pick back in the 2021 draft. Isaiah Foskey was a second round pick last year. So I actually think like this, the names on this list are actually pretty impressive. If you can get reasonable production out of the final 3 names, out of 2 of those 3 names, then I feel like this is a really strong group. If 2 out of 3 of Chase Young, Peyton Turner, Isaiah Foskey can stay healthy, stay on the field, and make an impact, then I feel like this group is really solid. If none of those 3 names do it, then you're in trouble. If only one of them does it, then I think you're going to be another scenario with, you know, sometimes you have that pass rush that impacts games and sometimes you don't. If there's an injury and you're missing one, you're really thin. So That's what I'm looking for. And it's going to be something that we can't really figure out until the games get here, right? Like last year, we looked at Peyton Turner and we're like, man, he's finally healthy. He was one of a handful of players, maybe 4 or 5 players that was actually involved in every single training camp practice last year. He got out there in week 1, making a play on the ball. He gets a turf toe injury and he's out until week 18, right? Like that's the frustrating thing. And so I'm not going to throw, I mean, I'll make note of it if Peyton Turner is healthy versus if he's not healthy, but I'm not going to use that as a case of like, this is going to be his year. He's so healthy in training camp, because that's what we thought last year and it didn't happen. So we'll see, but the cuts, Trajan Jeffcoat, Nico Lalos, Nate Latu. If I had to pick a guy who was on that fringe, like say one of these defensive tackles that I'm about to name falls off a cliff and you just do not feel like you can keep him around and you end up going with 3 instead of 4, then Trajan Jeffcoat would be the first guy on my list of, he can probably fill that role, that inside-outside rusher like Tano did. I think his game is similar, and we've seen him make some plays already. So we'll see how that goes. But for now, I'm going with 5 defensive ends, 1 fewer than I typically would. Now, defensive tackle, like I said, I'm keeping 4, and that group is Colin Saunders, Nathan Shepard, Brian Brzee, Christian Boyd. And I'm keeping Boyd not necessarily because I expect him to play a ton, but because I don't like cutting draft picks if I don't have to. And again, if I was keeping a 6th defensive end, Boyd probably would be on the cut line because I need those 3 guys above him to play a role. And what I'm hoping to see is that Brian Brzee throughout camp, throughout the preseason, is ready to step into a more 3-down type role. You don't draft a first-round defensive tackle if you only expect them to be in a rotational role. And so I want to see Brian Brzee, no rhyme intended there, be more effective against the run. I need his pad level to be better. I need him to hold his ground a lot more and kind of prove that he's not just a pass rushing 3-technique defensive tackle. Colin Saunders' role, I think, is safe as that kind of nose inside guy. And Christian Boyd is, in my opinion, kind of the backup to Colin Saunders. He's more of a nose than he would be a 3-technique. And then you have Nathan Shepard, Brian Brzee, who can be that kind of 3-technique rotation with the expectation that there's at least one defensive end who could kind of rotate in and play alongside Brian in those NASCAR packages where we saw him and Tano kind of shine last year and really make life hell on opposing quarterbacks. Go watch the Week 17 game against the Bucks, and you'll see a lot of that. Go watch Week 5 against the Patriots, and you'll see a lot of that. That's kind of a situation that I'm not sure how to project right now, but it's going to be important. The cuts at defensive tackle, nothing particularly controversial. Kyler Baugh, Jack Heflin, Kendall Vickers. Now, Kendall Vickers is a guy who's looked solid. If I had to pick a guy who's probably the closest to making this group that isn't on that list right now of the defensive tackles I'm keeping, it's Vickers. He's made a couple plays. He's gotten his hand on a couple passes. He just looks solid. So keep that in mind. You'll see a lot of these roster projections. And, when you look at, when I talk about players that I think are close, I think that's like when I go around, if I was to survey all of these roster projections, I expect you'll find roster projections with Kendall Vickers on it, right? Like that's when I'm talking about that. That's what I mean. Like, because I considered putting him on there. I'm not putting him on there, but I could see him on there. This is not like set in stone. I make changes every time, not a ton of changes, but you could convince me. If someone was sitting across from me arguing that, hey, Kendall Vickers should be that guy instead of Christian Boyd, it's a fair argument. I can understand why you would say that is my point. That's kind of where I'm landing there. Let's go to linebacker next. And this is a position, the first of the positions that, we saved a roster spot at offensive line. We saved a roster spot on defensive line. Well, why did I do that? Because I wanted to keep an extra linebacker. Okay. And so now the top 3 names on this list are straightforward, right? Demario Davis, Pete Werner, Willie Gay. Not much of a question there. You're keeping those 3 guys. That you're starting Mike, that you're starting Will, and that you're starting Sam. And I think that you could make the argument that Willie Gay and Pete Werner could be interchangeable at the Will and the Sam. I want to see Willie Gay in sub packages. The Ruby package is the one that they would typically use him in the most. And that would be, so I think you'll see combination players. I think you'll see combination personnel packages with Demario and Pete. I think you'll see combination personnel packages with Demario and Willie. And I'm curious to see if you have any personnel combinations with Willie and Pete, but you just typically don't see DeMario come off the field for any reason. So that's probably unlikely that you would see the two of them on the field barring injury, which DeMario has never missed a game with injury since he's been on the Saints. So I wouldn't expect them to plan for that extensively. Either way, those three guys are making the roster. And so I'm keeping three more linebackers. And so it's going to be, in my opinion, a race between four players. And those four players are DeMarco Jackson, Jalen Ford, Khaleke Hudson, and Anthony Orji. I'm cutting Anthony Orji only because I need to see him make an impact a little bit more in practices before I'm willing to put him ahead of either of these kind of more veteran players or the rookie draft pick. And so I'm keeping Jalen Ford right now. It's fifth round pick. I'm already cutting one draft pick. I don't want to cut a second one if I don't have to. I just feel like he's going to get picked up on waivers somewhere. And even if not, I just want to have him in this group because I drafted him for this group. Again, kind of like Spencer Rattler, like I'm going to give him some grace in his rookie season, not being perfect right away after missing rookie minicamp and most of the OTA sessions. I'm not going to hold that against him. And so I'm keeping him on the roster. DeMarco Jackson, another fifth round pick from 2 years ago. He missed his rookie season with an injury. I thought he was solid last year. And right now I kind of feel like, hey, this is the same coaching staff in terms of special teams and defense. They liked him last year. He was involved. He made plays on special teams. I expect you'll see that again. And so I'm going with him. And so the next one is Khaleke Hudson, Anthony Orji. And you brought in Khaleke for a reason, right? You brought him in to be kind of that special teams guy with some upside, having played a significant number of snaps on the defensive side of the ball with Washington last year. So if you did end up in a situation where you needed to play him in the defense, you at least know what you're looking at there. So for now, I'm keeping him. It is a little unfair because Anthony has been here. He was here last year. He stuck around on the practice squad all year. He's built like a truck. I don't think he can cover, but okay, what is his upside on special teams? And I think that's where you'll make that determination between DeMarco, Khaleke, and Anthony is watch those special teams reps closely. Where are those guys lining up? What impact are they making? Right. And if one of those guys is making a bigger impact than the other one, that's where you'll slot them ahead. So for now, again, the six linebackers, DeMario, Pete, Willie Gay, DeMarco Jackson, Jalen Ford, Khaleke Hudson. The cuts, Monty Rice, Isaiah Stalbird, and Anthony Orji. But again, you could argue that you want to keep five, which makes those decisions even harder because you have to pick two of them instead of three of them. Or you could make the argument that you should be keeping Anthony. Beyond that, I don't see much conversation to be had about Isaiah, who's a player that I like. I just think he's a developmental guy, and Monty Rice, who, I just don't see much out of him in terms of keeping him. All right. Next up. So we have 10 roster spots remaining. And we have arrived at probably the easiest position to project in the history of Saints position projections. And that is cornerback, assuming health and assuming there are no trades made. Because I think you're keeping four cornerbacks, and they are the four obvious names, and that's Marshawn Lattimore, Paulson Adebo, Alontae Taylor, and Kool-Aid McKinstry. You feel great about it. You have your starting outside corners in Marshawn and Paulson. You have your starting slot corner right now in Alontae Taylor. And then you have an elite backup option, depth option at either outside spot or at the slot in Kool-Aid McKinstry. And as we get into training camp, I think Kool-Aid's going to get a chance to compete for that slot corner role. So if he beats out Alontae, then you have Alontae as that elite backup option at either outside spot or in the slot. And so again, not unlike last year, you feel really good about it. Last year, you had Ike Yadam kind of being that backup guy. He's now with the 49ers. We'll get to see him in training camp in the preseason, both in that preseason game and in those joint practices. But it's a straightforward mission here. We don't need to talk a ton about it. The cuts are Rezjon Wright, Rico Payton, and Shamar John Charles. And I think all three of those guys are practice squad options. All three of those guys are top-end special teams options. So you could make the argument that, hey, we're going to keep one of those extra guys and call him a defensive back because he stands out on special teams. Just because he's a cornerback, we don't need to say, well, he can't make it. For now, I'm keeping safeties just because I think the safety depth is a little bit more important in terms of if you have a defensive back who's going to stand out on special teams, I want him to be able to play multiple positions. And I think the safeties currently have a better ability to do that. And there's a couple veteran options that I do like. So Rezjon Wright, Rico Payton, I think are both practice squad options. Same with Shamar, but I think Rezjon and Rico have been a little bit above him. So we'll go. Final position. We've made it. One more position to go, and it is safety. Much like a handful of these other positions, not unlike linebacker, you have some very obvious options at the top, and that's Tyrann Mathieu, no question, obviously. Jordan Howden, definitely making the roster. Jonathan Abram, in my opinion, is a lock to make the roster. Then one more lock, and it's JT Gray, who, he's never going to be a high upside player in the actual defense, but he's making the roster. He is the special teams captain. He's always, on the top of the list in terms of all pro options at specialist at special teams ace. So we're gonna keep him on the roster. So that's 4 of them. So that means that you have 2 more spots to pick between, let's say 6 people. Because you could say it's Ugo Amadi, Will Harris, Lawrence Johnson, Millard Bradford, Faion Hicks, because we're talking about safety. But you could also convince me that you should keep 5 cornerbacks and 5 safeties because you want to keep Rezjon Wright as a special teams ace. It doesn't have to be a safety. In this case, I'm making it a safety because, in my opinion, Ugo Amadi is making this roster. I'm not going to call him a lock, but I feel really good about what he has done. And he's going into year 2 in this system. The coaching staff likes him. They brought him back for a reason. And he has played very well in that slot role. So if you end up in a scenario where you need to just get to your 3rd string slot corner, he's a guy who I trust in special teams. I trust to play either safety spot, maybe not at the top end, but I trust him to do it. And if in a pinch, I can throw him outside and have him be kind of that outside corner. Again, in a desperation scenario. But if I can fulfill desperation scenarios without having to add a spot on my roster for that player, I'm going to do it. So Ugo is my 5th safety. Then the 6th one, and this is one you could debate me on strongly, and I'll probably flip-flop on this to some extent as we go forward, is Will Harris. Just a veteran, kind of like Ugo, right? Like, I want veteran players who will accept their role, who I trust on special teams, who could play another position or multiple positions in a pinch if I needed. And he's one of those guys, right? It's a guy that you know what to expect from. And so he is the 53rd man on my roster. He is the last keep. And it's not just because this is the last position I got to. He is very literally, in my opinion, the final spot. Okay, so if you're keeping another player at any other position, he's the one who drops off my list. Now, I'm not going to rank the other 52, but there's a handful of other players who you could say, hey, if I want to keep 2 other players, this would be that guy. But for now, keep that in mind. Will Harris, I'm keeping on this roster, but I'm not going to say he's hanging by a thread. But it's if this was Velcro, it's not fully Velcroed in, right? There's only a couple hanging, and you can just yank it off. But either way, he in my opinion has done enough to earn this spot on my illustrious list. Not that he cares, not that any of these players will care, not that any one of these players probably will care, but he's got something to prove in terms of all these guys, all 6 of these defensive backs that I have cut could come in and take that spot from him. But all right, that's it. That is my 53-man roster projection after minicamp, pre-training camp. It'll almost certainly change, but got to start somewhere. If you want to check it out, the written version of this, go over to wwl.com. There's also a link in there to my initial 53-man roster projection, the one prior to OTAs in minicamp. So if you want to kind of compare and see the changes, that would be the way to do it. Either way, thanks everyone for watching and listening. If you got all the way to the end and you haven't hit that subscribe button, please do that. Really do appreciate it. If you know friends, family that like to listen to podcasts like the Saints, don't mind my nasally Ray Romano voice. Hey, pass this along, say, check this out. And, if they hate it, then you can blame me because I gave you a bad idea. But all right. Who dat? Go Saints. Until the next time, be easy, y'all. Peace.